Chapter 1. The Lady. Evelyn watched as the young suitor disappeared through the chamber's doors. A sigh escaped her lips as she gazed in agony at her maidens, who watched her from the other side of the room. She could almost read the expressions on their faces, and she could sense their jealousy, for she had sent yet another on his way out. The man that had come to her this evening was one of the most handsome fellows in the village. But they didn't understand, Evelyn concluded. They didn't understand the yearning inside her. Even she couldn't understand that little voice inside her head mocking her, crawling inside her. Though, strangely, the little voice had slowly grown into profound desires, and had now moved from her head to the mouth between her legs, throbbing and aching to escape and fulfill her deep longings. Those men wouldn't satisfy her hunger, Evelyn concluded. They wouldn't know how to. They couldn't even satisfy a peasant girl. How would they satisfy a woman like her? She was hungry, but the hunger that consumed her was something they wouldn't comprehend. How could she make them understand that? She decided to take a walk to ease her mind and silence the desires working their way from within a secret place she dared not speak. She went to the ruins she used to play in when she was a young girl. As a child she had searched her adventure, but now as a woman she seemed to be in search of far more than just any playtime. And this evening, while strolling through the ruins of the castle Evelyn had visited as a child, she wandered far and long. She searched for the roses that bloomed in abundance, and sometimes danced along the edge of the brick walls of the castle. But she found none, to her surprise, and wandered further, searching high and wide, longing for their fragrance, but again there was nothing. Disappointed, she stopped. Already far in the depths of the ruins, she found herself unafraid of how vastly it had changed over the years. It had been long since she had revisited the old place. She didn't recognize it, at first, until upon closer examination she made out the familiar patterns. Angry she became at how old and dark it was. Ruined indeed, she thought, with eyes wide and alive. And she feared the place now, never having before as a child. She feared it, and didn't understand why, when once she'd played in peace, without the slightest bit of discomfort, as she felt now. At last she came upon a part of the castle, a passage hidden well among the bushes and shrubs. Evelyn pushed away vines that covered the entranceway and observed from a distance. In the centre of the court where she stood was a large fountain, and water was flowing out of a baby angel's mouth, covered likewise by the shrubs and vines. The stone figure aimed his arrow as if he were pointing towards something on the opposite side of the room, where yet more bushes covered the very back. It was dark, but Evelyn was not scared, and excitedly, with full determination, ventured forward. She delightfully wondered what might await her there. The longing in her tightened, the excitement deepened. She was not brave, just daring, and dangerously living every single part of her life. She didn't fear the hard arms of a stranger's embrace or the touch of bodies. In fact, she longed for them, and feared the day would never come. She fruitlessly longed each and every day. Her royal name had kept her a prisoner from filth and rubbish. It was difficult to find a person who didn't know her and dared not to please her, or yet allowed himself this rebellious pleasure at her consent, for after all she was a queen, but she hated the limits her title brought her. Evelyn knew nothing of such in the practice, but could sense and almost feel the aching of the ritual. She knew it well because it throbbed between her legs each and every day. She found herself dreaming of a situation where she was walking along the path of her private place, alone and dreaming, enjoying the sights around her, the creatures singing and birds flying above. And then feeling the eyes of another watching her every move as she stopped to listen to footsteps coming closer to her aching body. Her breath would become heavy, and she would gasp in ecstasy, longing for it, her undergarments growing wet with anticipation, aching and sticking to her very body. She dreamt of staring up at the pale moon, lighting through the cracks onto her wavy strands of hair, feeling and sensing hands reaching out to touch her. The dream was so real. She could feel it unravel. Steps grew closer until hands were wrapped around her waist and caressing her tender breasts. She felt alive as they grabbed hard at her chest with a strange rage. Excitement ravaged her body as she became wet with longing for sexual pleasure. The stranger's body pressed her back against his larger frame, a hard and large cock pushing against her slender backside, erect and ready to pierce her fragile and awaiting form. Yes, Evelyn hissed. She wanted nothing else but the pleasure she longed for. But these hands took their time, feeling the softness of her body, prolonging her awaited desires. Evelyn ached and longed for the stranger to take her, and just as she no longer could contain her madness, he did. His hands raced down her silky dress, between the parting of her legs, lifting the gown that concealed her pale and bare frame. She giggled and exhaled delightfully as fingers parted the underwear and touched her in places she longed to be probed. Yes, Evelyn gasped, feeling the same fingers race to her erect nipples to pinch them, then savagely rip apart the collar of her gown. Oh, but she didn't mind. It wasn't like she liked that dress anyway, and she laughed, letting her arms fall freely in ecstasy as the stranger had his way with her. The stranger's hands touched her bare flesh now, raced to the very core of her wet cunt, and pierced it repeatedly until she was dancing, impaling it freely. She had never felt so bold and so daring, but she wanted even more. The stranger's hands ripped the rest of her dress off until she stood completely naked. She fell forward to her knees on the very ground, clinging to her very desire. The grass tingled on her bare body as it touched her flesh. She felt the cock press against her bare buttocks and fall between them, sliding inside her at the core. Evelyn gasped delightfully, hoping it would never end. The stranger took her from behind, grabbing her breasts for leverage. She felt his hard cock savagely inside her and cried and laughed within pleasure all at once. Yes, yes, Evelyn screamed, and harder the stranger's love tore rammed inside her, making her love it even more. Finally, she felt those very hands force her forward, tossing and twisting her to face him. She would now see the very savage lover she had longed to tease her, with delight and ecstasy. When her legs twisted slightly and he mounted her, she dared not open her eyes at first, even when she felt his hard body upon her. She was too excited to ruin the magical moment, too excited to be dirty, like the bad queen she longed to be. The stranger continued ramming into her. His long, hard love-making would not end, no matter what happened. She was pleased as she felt his hard and large cock pound and beat the very end of her. She was gasping, her eyes still closed, her heart and excitement still alive with gasps and moans escaping her puffy lips. She wondered if she would dare to open her eyes and look at the face of her great lover. She wanted to. The feeling of that very large and hard cock would not leave her be, despite her uncertainty. Tentatively, she began to open her eyes, slowly looking into the shadows. Blurry it was at first. She was too involved in just feeling, and her excitement to worry too much about what faced her. She longed for his face to excite her. This man would be the one suitor to win her heart. Of that she was sure. She gasped and came to the moment of excitement repeatedly and slowly opened her very eyes. At once she saw her lover's face, her savage stranger. Evelyn let out a tiny, startled gasp and gasped again as she came to a moment of ecstasy. She wondered crazily if she had seen correctly, if it was possible that her lover was a beast, a monster. She didn't cry out or try to pull away from it. She gazed at it, wondered, bewitched and amazed, but there it was, pounding her very wet lower mouth, exciting her, delighting her with ecstasy. She didn't stop him. She didn't even move away, though she was as speechless and paralyzed as she had never been. The creature simply stared at her, its eyes widening in ecstasy and its breath heavy and heaving with rampage. It was covered in sweat, and saliva dripped from its very mouth. Its raspy panting puffed with difficulty from its mouth, moist and warm on her bare white body, and still it moved, its strokes in and out of her repeatedly like a horny monster, and she dared not stop it. She hated to admit she was loving it as she did, but it was true. The more she felt it, the more she watched it, the more it excited her. It was aroused, and the more she watched it, the more she wanted to feel its warm, wide and large tool penetrate her. And for that she did not say anything. For that reason she let it fuck her. The creature gasped, its breath becoming heavier and monstrous. It growled and howled until it was moving faster inside her. It frightened her, but she did nothing as she felt it ravage her so profoundly that it made her feel more alive than she had ever been. She was alive and awakening, and she could sense it would not harm her as long as it was pleasuring her. The creature soon came over her closely. She trembled as she felt its hard cock rip and force into her. She gasped in delight, and she could see it smile as if it knew it had pleased her. The feeling was magically sinful. She almost didn't care it was facing her, its snout very close to her mouth. It couldn't kiss her, even if it would have wanted to. Its mouth was too large. It had the face of a lion, with yellow hair coming down its mane, with the rest of it the form of a man. Its eyes pierced her soul as it looked down at her with desire and longing, as if to say it would never let her go, and for that she hoped. It howled as it drove its large cock into her yet again, and as it came it licked her cheek in a longing kiss. Evelyn cried out, feeling his erection at the end of her, then dropped her head back in sheer ecstasy. Their cries were endless, hers and the creature's, as she felt it nipping her breasts, his teeth softly biting her nipples with tiny sloppy licks of its large and rough tongue. She screamed in delight as his cock, still hard, thrust forward into her repeatedly. Then one last time it licked her, and, howling profoundly, it came. It was quiet, and the Queen was looking about. She wondered if it had actually even happened. She thought so. The wetness between her legs had convinced her it had, so perhaps in her mind it had. Visiting the castle always brought memories of places and things she had once done. Had she made love to a wild animal, a half-man, half-beast creature? She smiled, if only she knew the very truth of such dreams she'd had since she was 18. She recalled that was when they had started, and she wondered if there was anything to the fact they had started then, or had they ever happened. Of that she wanted to be sure more than anything. What childish dreams, she thought to herself, only now realizing how easily they had drenched her garments and left her breathless in hope. She wandered deeper into the ruins. The light of the day was going down slowly over the horizon, but still Evelyn did not worry. There was not a person for miles away, and this land she knew quite well. The castle ruins had been her territory for many years, a family past she longed to forget. She stood in the centre where the angel statue had greeted her, with his arched arrow, as if he meant to pierce her very heart. Its frozen body was still in the shadowy light and stillness all around her. The water was still flowing from the fountain, vines breaking away at the edges of its bowl, stretching into the marble and twisting against the statue's body. Evelyn looked away. Behind her was that eerie corner she had tried to forget, the place where the sun's rays dared not shine. What lurked in there, she wondered curiously. Was it yet another room with hidden treasures? She inched forward and paused to glance back at the angel as if he would warn her not to continue. She exhaled and turned back to the inviting hallway ahead. Over the passage, long vines draped desperately, trying to conceal it from Evelyn's wonder and curiosity. Now she felt she must venture ahead and seek the unknown that dared cry out to her. and she moved forward slowly, pushing away the vines and clearing the bushes with a single hand. She advanced, driven by curiosity and excitement, the wetness between her legs searching for a way to quench the hunger. With no answer to it, she moved on. A breeze of air from the darkness where the light no further could go stopped her, for ahead of her she sensed something coming to greet her. She didn't move, looking into the darkness where the light had stopped and offered no clue of what lay beyond. As she looked, she now could see a shape emerge out of the darkness. Had a stranger followed her, or had he always been there, Evelyn thought. She was not scared, although any right person should be. She often wondered if she was daring or just stupid. She pondered if her maidens ever thought the same. She didn't care. After all, she had left without her guardians, although they had begged her. It was not safe for a beautiful queen such as herself to be out on her own. But she didn't care. She wanted to be free and take walks alone if she wished. After all, it was her kingdom. She was in charge. But her clerics were sometimes outspoken tyrants, which was something she liked that about them to a certain degree, except not as much when they flirted with her. For Evelyn was the most beautiful woman in her kingdom, and even the men of God wanted to please her, and she was aware of that. They aimed to please her, all of them. They said it was in God's name that they pleased the queen, to excuse their nudity when they came to her room. She didn't mind it any longer. At first it had surprised her, startled her when she was much younger. As a girl she had been introduced into a different world. Her world where she could have anything and anyone. The cleric, Peter, was an older man, a man with a greying beard, a man who loved looking at her. He bathed her, but never had he touched her improperly. He longed for it, Evelyn noted, and she provoked his desires, sleeping without a single item of clothing. Peter made no sound as she rose to greet him, bare with her round breasts, swaying freely. He dared not look away, for to do so was disrespect. At an early age, she had offerings. Clerics were not shy in that. They called it the cleansing of the Virgin. They took her into the master chamber and disrobed before her, inviting her to touch and examine their bodies. This would wash the impurities from her mind. Her priests and clerics' main reason of existence was to keep her body and mind clean. Evelyn did not argue with the men. She quite enjoyed it. She loved walking into the room and looking at their bodies, and having the men beg to be her chosen ones. "Take me, my queen, I will cleanse you, I will serve you." And each one would drop to the floor to kiss her naked feet. She would touch their erect cocks, watch their eager bodies quiver, but their faces would remain calm and still. However, their bodies would betray them. A few managed to remain still, a few ejected at a gentle touch from her. Those fell to their knees in shame and were dragged away, their chances possibly ruined forever. Evelyn never sexually pleasured any. They all longed for it, but were happy with the stroke of her gentle caress, if nothing else. Evelyn smiled, knowing that was all everyone wanted from her. And Peter gazed madly in her direction as she moved along the line of naked clerics, examining them. He was not naked, but he wanted her more than anyone else did. Evelyn was aware of that. But he dared not declare it. A touch here, a brush there, a gently caress on the thigh, Peter's sign of affection. She welcomed it like a careless teenager. But Peter dared nothing more. What was he afraid of? He was fashioned by the church, ruled by her, but following the church's rules to a T. "The queen is a goddess," he'd say. "The queen is our gift from God." Evelyn played with him. Had it bothered him? It didn't appear to. Evelyn's body shook. Her desires had been confirmed. When she could see the form was a muscular figure. Had he followed her? She grinned, delighted. If so, what could he be looking for? She only hoped it was to ravish her body. This had been her dream for so long when Peter had cowered away. Had it been this stranger's dream to make love to a queen, as it had been Peter's? She almost felt herself inviting the stranger. She inched back away slowly, as it was now moving towards her, and she stumbled into the centre where the angel had first greeted her with its deadly arrow. She could see his eyes, but they didn't seem like human eyes, and she almost danced with joy. Her body quivered as she stared into the unknown, hoping to pull away with him. She waited patiently as the stranger moved closer, out of the shadows towards her, to stand out in the open, slightly lit room where she was now standing. He moved like a creature stalking a fragile animal, ready to devour it and pull it into its den. She thought back to her dreams and desires, finding herself back in that ecstasy of sexual arousal. She wanted it and ached for it. Her lower lips were soaked with it, aching desire, that is. Her lips sighed in the breeze that played with her long brown hair and brushed it gently like a caress. She would have thought it was her stranger already upon her. If she didn't have her eyes open, she would have sworn it was him. The stranger moved slowly. What she saw should have startled her, and would have left any young, naive girl frightened. But Evelyn was far from that, far from any naive girl. The stranger of her desires was not any man she had seen before. In fact, he was no man. He was a beast man, if one could call it that. It had the face of a lion, and the body and form of a man, arms as muscular and defined in lines as any normal man would have, legs as bold and toned all the same as any others, a chest strong and marked, with abs to match. But the face was not human, and its eyes gazed at her with both a human's longing and an animal's hunger. It snarled slightly, as much as invitation to her as it was a warning. Evelyn stepped back slowly as it came to stand a distance from her, gazing and growling at her like a mad dog. Its tongue traced the side of its lips and its slightly large mouth. For a creature, its face was fairly small and almost human in definition, although it was far from appearing so. Could her dreams be turning into a reality? She gasped. What did it want? She feared it wasn't after the same thing she wished for. She had to find out, be sure that she wasn't in any real danger, yet she didn't feel threatened or afraid, though she probably should. She could see it in his eyes. Evelyn lifted her skirt slightly, slipping her hands beneath. The creature watched, snarling, almost with human desire in its eyes, watching her like a scared animal defending its territory. In fact, Evelyn didn't doubt that for a moment it was like a frightened dog, marking its home or where it had been. This was no different. He probably had never seen another being, or at least a human being, or for that matter, a female, she concluded. It simply watched as she removed her undergarments and pulled them from beneath the dress. The creature darted slightly over a few steps, watchful like a beast, or curious like a man. Evelyn smiled as she held up her soaked underwear in one. She could see the creature catch the scent. Its nose rose up slightly as she waved the garments, extending her hand outward. It sniffed the air in front of it like any dog would. Evelyn could see it continuously moving its head, gathering her fragrance. Perhaps it had already known it was there, she concluded, like an animal in heat. But that was describing her, for she had called it with her desires. She gasped. She didn't have to search for a clue to know that it was true, for when she looked again, the creature's erect organ was stiff at an angle. A monstrous cock appeared erect and hard behind heavy fur. Its monstrous size lifted and was quite visible from beneath. Evelyn smiled. That was one way to know it would not hurt her, and she did yet something even bolder. She tossed the garment at his feet to further invite her dream lover to be sure of his intentions. The creature looked over at her. A slight drool was starting to drip from the corner of its mouth, yet its eyes and its face were at ease and calm with an almost mellow ecstasy seen in both animals and humans. She was sure he understood, as she was sure she wanted it to happen. Her once dream would soon become a reality, or so she hoped. The creature knelt near her offering, its nostrils flaring up instinctively as the scent poured out of the garment in its hand. It lifted the silk underwear from where Evelyn had tossed them at his feet. Its golden mane was long and thick, dancing with the movement of its body. Curls of wavy strands dangled down its rugged, manly body. Evelyn longed to run her fingers over them and yearned to do even more. A lot more, and she ached thinking of his monstrous arms embracing her and that enormous cock ripping the very core of her wet lips. The creature took the offering in his hand at once. No hesitation, no doubt, no, not even a thought to examine it and wonder what possibly could it be. It knew, Evelyn concluded, as it took the garment and pressed it to its nose, hungrily inhaling its fragrance. Suddenly the perfume drove him mad. A growl escaped its mouth viciously, and for the first time Evelyn feared for her life. Her heart suddenly began to beat so fast she thought it would explode inside her. What had she done? What had she been thinking? Was she mad? It was an animal. She backed away, hoping to escape if she had to. But the creature was already steps closer and moving rapidly towards her, its cock now parallel to its body. Foolish woman, she scolded herself, feeling trapped. Evelyn shrank back, frightened and trembling. She pulled her arm over her face to shield herself from the creature's rampage, but when she sensed nothing, she looked up to see the creature had stopped suddenly in its tracks. Had it sensed her fear, or seen it on her face, in her eyes even? She didn't know if it wasn't merely driven by instinct. Perhaps it was entirely human, perhaps it wasn't. She couldn't be sure, but it intrigued her and fascinated her no matter how much she was shaking. The creature gazed at her, its features eased yet again, although it didn't move back. Evelyn, alongside the fountain, stared right at it nervously. She didn't know whether to run or remain still. She was curious, though, no doubt, and a part of her told her there was really nothing to fear. The creature made motions as though it was trying to communicate. "You invited me." He lifted her garment, still in his hand. Wasn't that what she wanted? She could almost feel it ask, knowing the offering she had tossed him. She nodded foolishly, no longer trembling, and took a step forward. It lapped its mouth repeatedly like a dog waiting for a bone. Its cock remained as hard and as erect, and the excitement on its face resurfaced. Now she had frightened it, perhaps put doubt in its intentions to fuck her. She had to regain its trust and assure it that it was yet all right. She came closer. Her heart had not stopped beating madly. She was longing for physical pleasure, a longing for nothing else than that. The creature moved back slowly into the hallway it had first crawled out of. Evelyn desperately raced to it. "No, don't go, please. I'm sorry," she begged like a naughty girl. But whether it understood or not, it walked slowly back until she could only see its shape in the darkness. Looking back at her from the shadows, it would soon leave, Evelyn thought. No, she couldn't let it go. "Please come back. If only you could understand," she thought, pleading desperately. She stood at the entrance of the hallway, pushing away the bushes, trying to call the animal back to her. "I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Please come back. Please come, I need you," she begged. But there was no use. The creature was slowly disappearing, its shape vanishing into the darkness. She wanted to follow but hesitated, and at the entrance she remained, unknowing what to do or how to get its attention. Desperately she moved forward, as if she would enter but could not proceed, as she saw the creature's shape at a distance. She could still reach him if she followed forward. The creature stared back at her and snarled as if to warn her, but she couldn't let him leave, not until he quenched her thirst, and so forward she moved into the darkness, guided by the large shape. She could still make out his cock from where she was. It was erect and long, wide and parallel to its body, as it had been when she first had seen it. Moving, she hurried even deeper. The creature had long since stopped at the end of the long corridor. She wondered if he was waiting for her, watching his shapely figure from a distance. It didn't move. A dim light covered it slightly, so she couldn't see its body through the thick black tunnel. Its eyes were the only visible thing through it, reflecting back as bright as a cat's. Evelyn stopped as he stepped back. She jumped forward. Still at a distance, she dashed slightly towards it. Did it want her to come and follow? She didn't doubt it. Again it stopped. She froze to examine her surroundings. The walls were covered in moss. It was damp and wet all around her, and vines dangled over her head, filled with thorns and brimming with tiny rose blooms. So this was where her beauties had hid, she thought, reaching for one. Beneath her feet the floor was covered with a bush of green bright grass, and had consumed the red bricks beneath it. She stumbled forward, releasing the rose from her caress. Feeling it prick her fingertip, she was careless as she reached down and lifted her gown to her waist. She ripped away at the dress, pulling savagely at the long opening at the centre of her bosom, peeling it back as she walked toward the figure in the shadows. She ripped at the fabric, tearing it away, releasing her ghostly, milky breasts, and allowing them to sway at her rampage. The creature was frozen now in its steps. It turned slightly at the sound of ripping cloths and growled madly and furiously. Evelyn pulled at the garment, exposing the bareness of her arms, then her waist, pushing the cloth down her body, and finally to her legs. She ripped the remaining lower part of her dress furiously until her bare, pale flesh was visible. She looked up to see the creature was slowing now, moving back towards her, yet hesitating with wonder and curiosity as it watched her from a distance. Evelyn knew she needed to do more to intensify him and make him regain trust of her. Although she now stood exposed from the waist down, she knew it was not enough to bring back the predator. The beast growled and snarled back at her, but didn't move from its spot. It remained in the shadows, waiting. Evelyn reached down, parting the petals of her wet mouth in further invitation, but again the creature didn't budge. She gathered the liquid that was dripping from her thigh with her hands and sprayed the air near her. The nectar filled the ambient and touched the rose petals and green grass on the ground near the creature's feet. The beast sniffed the air again and knelt on the floor to smell the grass nearby. At once it lifted its growling face and darted out slightly, but stopped yet again in its tracks. It stood in the darkness, unmoving. "Please come to me. Can't you see? I need you," she hissed desperately, but to no avail. The creature moved back again. She feared she would lose it and her dream would never come to be. Suddenly she realized, in order to intensify an animal, one must act like one, she thought as she knelt on the ground. As she did, the beast stopped and moved back towards the entrance. Evelyn didn't stop there. She turned away, her back to the beast, lowered her body to the ground and presented her round, firm buttocks to the beast. She waited with her waist lifted to the air, her cunt drenched with her love juices dripping down the inside of her legs. The scent of sex lingered in the air. It drove the animal wild and her beastie man mad as she heard him approaching her. Her heart was throbbing wildly in her chest as she felt its breath brush her ear. It pulled her waist to him. Its clawed hands gently grabbed her as if it knew to be careful with her pale body. She ached, waiting to feel its cock impale her, but she felt its tongue lapping the opening of her vagina, licking the nectar off her instead. She howled in agony as it sniffed between her legs, grazing her softly. "Yes," she gasped, feeling the wet, warm tongue brushing away with gentle strokes, but madly she wanted the cock inside her. She felt its clawed hands on her buttocks, spreading her, and the tongue would not stop tasting every inch of her. She loved it. It was delicious, but she longed even more for the cock, until finally she felt every inch of the large organ squeezed into her. She cried out, and when she did, the beast howled at the sound of her cries. Once it was inside her, the beast didn't stop. She was in agony when it finally gasped, and it turned her around. She stared up into its beastly face as its nose came down over her body, sniffing it, licking her flesh. It caressed her breasts gently with its wet and warm tongue. Snarling, it moved down over her repeatedly. Evelyn danced in ecstasy, allowing herself to feel free as she let herself drop back. The creature held her gently in its embrace as he drilled its monstrous cock into the very core of her body, its tongue continuously licking her breasts and the surrounding of her belly. "Yes, do as you want with me, my beastie lover," she howled. The creature snarled and moved into her with monstrous rage as it knew what she wanted. "Don't stop. Yes. More, I want more." And so it gave her everything she ever wanted, ravishing her madly until she was screaming in sheer pleasure. The creature howled along with her cries until they ended in an orgasm of pure satisfaction and into the long night.